There is a particular kind of discomfort an avoidant can experience that rarely gets talked about. It is not the initial alarm that makes them pull away. It is not simply the vulnerability that appears when genuine feelings develop. And it is not even the emptiness that follows after they create distance from someone who mattered. This discomfort is quieter and more personal. It appears when the way they behaved is placed beside another person's genuine maturity, revealing something about themselves they would rather not face. And you did not have to do anything dramatic to create that realization. You did not confront them, lecture them about attachment, demand an explanation, or make a scene. You did not chase them, issue ultimatums, or display emotional distress that would give them something to defend against. You simply handled yourself differently. You moved through the situation with dignity, and that created a contrast. That contrast is where the embarrassment comes from. An avoidant often has a particular image of themselves, not necessarily a superior or arrogant image, but one built around being capable, rational, independent, and self-contained. They see themselves as someone who knows what they need, handles responsibilities, and manages life without depending heavily on anyone else. In many areas, that self-image may be completely believable. They can function well professionally, maintain friendships, solve problems, and stay composed under pressure. Then intimate relationships reveal another side. They withdraw without explaining. They become warm and then suddenly distant. They create space through behavior instead of honest communication. They may care internally while presenting themselves as barely invested, and sometimes they only move towards you when they sense that you are genuinely moving away. Now place that behavior beside yours. You processed what happened. You allowed yourself to grieve without turning your pain into a performance. You worked through your emotions instead of using them to control the other person. You rebuilt your life. You became independent because you healed, not because you wanted to appear indifferent. Eventually, your indifference became real. That is what makes the contrast so powerful. Their behavior may not have been cruel or malicious. They may not be a bad person, but they can still be emotionally immature in the specific area where intimacy requires vulnerability, accountability, consistency, and emotional presence. They may be highly developed in almost every other part of life, while still using much younger emotional defenses when someone gets close. And your maturity makes that difference visible without you ever having to say it. Embarrassment for an avoidant often does not look like obvious remorse. You may never hear them admit they handled things badly. You may never see an emotional apology or direct acknowledgement. Instead, the feeling often goes inward, because their identity is strongly connected to competence and self-sufficiency. Realizing that another person handled emotional difficulty with greater maturity can create a very specific discomfort. Their usual defenses are designed to prevent this kind of exposure. Keep feelings private. Maintain control. Do not depend too much on anyone. Create distance when closeness feels threatening. Those strategies may have worked for years, but genuine intimacy eventually reaches the places those strategies were designed to protect. And you saw the difference. Not because you were searching for their weaknesses, but because you were present enough to recognize the gap between how they presented themselves and how they behaved when emotional closeness became difficult. Your awareness did not have to be judgmental. It simply had to be honest. And honest awareness can be uncomfortable when someone realizes they have been accurately seen. Your maturity mattered because you did not respond to their avoidance with matching emotional chaos. You did not desperately chase them. You did not lose yourself trying to restore the connection. You did not make your entire emotional world depend on whether they returned. You felt the pain, processed it, and continued living. You did not pretend to be strong. You became stronger. You did not create a new life to make them jealous. You created one because it was yours. That is why the contrast can hit so deeply. You were more emotionally mature about the situation than they were. That is not an insult. It is simply an honest observation about how two people handled the same emotional experience. And for someone who values independence, competence, and self-control, realizing that another person handled emotional pain with greater maturity can challenge their self-image. But embarrassment does not always bring an avoidant closer. Sometimes it creates more distance. They may begin explaining their behavior to themselves. They may tell themselves why withdrawing was reasonable, why the timing was wrong, why the relationship was too complicated, or why they needed space. Some of those explanations may even contain truth, but underneath them can still be another uncomfortable realization. I know how I behaved. Instead of openly confronting that feeling, they may argue with it internally. And sometimes the easiest way to reduce that discomfort is to create more distance from the person who saw them clearly. If they are not around you, they do not have to feel the contrast as strongly. If they do not talk to you, they do not have to face the difference between who they believe they are and how they actually behaved. This is why embarrassment can sometimes look like silence rather than remorse. But embarrassment itself does not guarantee growth. It can lead to self-reflection, or it can lead to defensiveness. One person feels embarrassed and thinks, I need to understand why I behaved this way. Another thinks, I need to prove to myself that I was right. The first creates the possibility of change. The second strengthens the defenses. So, if the avoidant feels embarrassed by the contrast between your maturity and their behavior, that does not automatically mean they will change, apologize, return, or become emotionally available. It simply means something has been registered, and sometimes that is the first step toward genuine self-awareness. What you did not do is also important. You did not lecture them. You did not explain their psychology. You did not give them a detailed account of every mistake they made. You did not tell them, this is your avoidant attachment. You simply lived differently. That is all. And that is everything. The contrast came from your behavior, not your accusations. It came from the way you processed the pain, continued your life, and refused to abandon yourself because someone else created distance. You did not make them look immature by calling them immature. You made the difference visible by becoming genuinely mature. And you should not use their embarrassment as leverage. Do not try to make them feel worse. Do not remind them of how badly they handled things. Do not turn your growth into a weapon. Let the realization remain confirmation. Confirmation that the difference was real. Confirmation that you were not imagining what happened. And confirmation that your maturity did not require their approval. They may never admit that you handled things better. They may never tell you that they recognize the difference, but they can still know it privately, and that is enough, because your growth does not need their acknowledgement. The life you built is yours. The emotional work you did is yours. The peace you developed is yours. The maturity you gained is yours. None of it depends on whether the avoidant understands it or comes back to validate it. If they use their discomfort to examine themselves, that is their journey. If they turn it into more defensiveness, that is also their journey. You do not have to manage either outcome. The deepest truth is simple. The avoidant may feel embarrassed because beside your genuine emotional maturity, their behavior became harder to explain away. But you did not create their embarrassment. You simply stopped hiding your growth. You became someone who no longer needed to chase, convince, perform, or prove. You did not expose them by attacking them. You exposed the difference by becoming different. And that maturity is not something you developed for their reaction. It belongs to you. Keep it, not as a trophy, not as proof that you won, and not as a way to make them regret losing you. Keep it because you learned that loving someone should never require abandoning yourself. As the evidence of your growth continues to show in the way you live, it becomes clear that the place you have reached is real, and it is worth staying there. You have done genuine inner work, and you do not need to return to the version of yourself that existed before it. The contrast that created the avoidance embarrassment was not accidental. It came from the difference in how the two of you handled the same emotional situation. Understanding that difference helps reveal what emotional maturity in an intimate relationship actually looks like. Emotional maturity is not the absence of emotion. It is not being unaffected, processing everything quickly, or pretending you do not need anyone. It is the ability to feel deeply while still behaving responsibly. You can experience hurt, grief, confusion, longing, and disappointment without allowing those emotions to control everything you do. You can be affected without losing yourself. You can feel deeply without abandoning your values. That ability develops over time. It comes from repeatedly paying attention to your inner world, understanding what you feel, and choosing responses that reflect who you want to be, instead of simply choosing whatever brings immediate relief. The avoidant emotional immaturity is often specific rather than global. They may be intelligent, responsible, successful, and highly capable in many areas of life. But intimate attachment can activate defenses that were created long before they developed healthier ways to handle vulnerability. At some point, closeness may have become associated with danger, rejection, pressure, disappointment, or loss of independence. Instead of learning how to remain connected while feeling vulnerable, they learned to manage closeness through distance. Your maturity made that difference visible, not because you pointed it out, because you were simply further along. Think about what you actually did when the relationship became painful. You grieved without turning your grief into a weapon. You did not use your pain to create guilt. You did not flood them with emotion to prove how deeply you cared. You did not make your suffering a tool for forcing them to respond. Your grief was simply grief. You felt it. You processed it. You moved through it. That matters because an avoidant can recognize the difference between genuine emotional processing and emotional pain being used to create guilt, reassurance, or renewed connection. You did not need their acknowledgement to know that your experience was real. That is another sign of maturity, trusting your own perception without requiring someone else to confirm it. Avoidant behavior can sometimes make you question your own experience. Their silence, distance, or minimization can quietly suggest that perhaps the connection was never as meaningful as you believed. Maybe you imagined the closeness. Maybe you cared more. Maybe it meant less than you thought. You did not allow their preferred narrative to rewrite your experience. You can accept what the relationship was without demanding that they validate every part of it. You know what happened. You know what you felt. You know what it cost. And you know what you learned. Then there is what you built afterward. You did not create a new life simply to get their attention or make them regret losing you. You invested in your life because it was yours. That may be the clearest expression of your maturity. Building during emotional difficulty requires the ability to redirect your energy toward what is actually available instead of remaining trapped in what you hoped would happen. You can grieve what you did not receive while still investing in what you do have. You can miss someone and still move forward. You can recognize that something mattered without allowing it to become the center of your existence. That ability to hold both realities at once is emotional maturity. The avoidant may notice this difference even indirectly. While you are processing and rebuilding, they may have relied more heavily on productivity, distraction, emotional control, or self-sufficiency. There is a difference between genuinely building a life and simply staying busy enough to avoid feeling what is happening inside. One creates growth. The other creates distance from emotion. This is why the embarrassment can be difficult to completely explain away. An avoidance defenses can create comfortable explanations. They can tell themselves why they needed distance, why the timing was wrong, why the relationship was incompatible, or why withdrawal was necessary self-protection. But your behavior is harder to argue against because you never accused them. You did not say, "You are immature." You did not tell them they handled everything badly. You simply handled yourself differently. An accusation can be rejected. A psychological label can be debated. But a visible contrast is harder to fight because it is not really a claim. It is what happened. Two people faced the same emotional situation. One processed it, grew through it, and continued building. The other relied more heavily on avoidance and emotional distance. The avoidant does not have to agree with your interpretation. They may never consciously call themselves immature, but they can still feel the difference. And that is why the embarrassment comes from inside them. You did not place it there. They notice something about themselves. What does that embarrassment ask of them? It asks for honest self-examination, not simply understanding attachment theory, not learning the word avoidant, not finding a psychological label that explains their behavior. It asks them to look directly at what they actually did. This is how I behaved. This is how I treated someone who cared about me. This is what my behavior created. And then comes the harder question. Why did I respond this way? That question requires looking beyond the comfortable explanations and examining the fear, wound, and defenses underneath the behavior. Your maturity cannot make them do that. Your patience cannot make them do that. Your love cannot make them do that. They must decide whether they are willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand what it is revealing. That choice belongs to them. And after all the closeness and distance, the pursuit and withdrawal, the confusion, silence, and rebuilding, the dynamic can reach an important point. Not necessarily a comfortable point, but a more honest one. The avoidant may have a harder time escaping the reality of how they behaved when compared with the maturity you demonstrated. And you have your own clarity. You know what the relationship was. You know what it cost. You know what you learned. You know what you built afterward, and you no longer need them to confirm any of it. That does not mean the relationship is resolved. It does not mean they will return. It does not guarantee that they will change. It simply means the truth has become harder to avoid, and honesty is the only place genuine change can begin. If they choose to examine themselves honestly, something new may become possible. If they refuse, the same defenses may continue. Either way, your responsibility remains the same. Stay where your growth has brought you. Do not return to confusion simply because they finally recognize what they lost. Do not abandon your maturity to make someone else comfortable. You have learned how to feel deeply without losing yourself. That is the real transformation. And whatever genuine change looks like from here, it should never require you to become less emotionally mature just to make the relationship feel familiar again. For the avoidant, genuine change after embarrassment requires more than simply realizing what happened. It requires concrete behavioral change. It means doing the deeper pattern-level work, learning to recognize their defenses, and practicing staying present when the alarm goes off instead of automatically creating distance. Embarrassment can be a useful beginning because it creates a direct realization. This is what my behavior actually looks like. That can be more powerful than simply understanding avoidant attachment intellectually, but embarrassment only becomes useful if they are willing to remain uncomfortable long enough to learn from it. They must resist turning the feeling into another defensive story that makes everything easier to dismiss. That choice belongs entirely to them. For you, genuine change has already happened. It is visible in the maturity you developed, the life you built, and the grounded way you now experience yourself. What comes next is not another dramatic transformation. It is simply continuing to live inside what you have already built. Keep investing in your life. Keep showing up honestly. Keep bringing your real self into relationships without constantly adjusting yourself around the avoidant's comfort, distance, reactions, or possible return. That kind of growth is rarely dramatic. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary Tuesday where you simply continue living as the person you worked so hard to become. And what do you owe their embarrassment? Nothing strategic, nothing punishing, nothing that turns their discomfort into leverage. You do not need to confront them about it. You do not need to remind them how mature you became while they remain stuck. You simply acknowledge the truth within yourself. The contrast was real. The growth was real. The maturity was earned. And if your maturity made their own behavior harder to ignore, that was simply the natural consequence of the difference between where the two of you were emotionally. Their embarrassment belongs to them. Your life continues without needing to adjust itself around what they do with that realization. The honest summary is simple. The avoidant may feel embarrassed because beside your maturity, their behavior became visibly immature. But you did not become mature to make them feel inferior. You did not process your pain so they would regret losing you. You simply chose to handle a difficult situation with dignity. Their embarrassment was a byproduct of that dignity. What happens next depends on what they do with the self-awareness that discomfort creates. Maybe it becomes genuine self-examination. Maybe that leads to deeper work. Maybe that work eventually produces real behavioral change. Or maybe they return to the same defenses. You cannot determine that. Your path is clearer. It is the life you have already built and the maturity you developed while building it. And that maturity came at a real cost. You had to feel the grief without turning it into manipulation. Genuine grief simply hurts. You had to trust your own perception without constantly needing confirmation. When their distance suggested the connection meant less than you believed, you had to resist shrinking your experience to fit their version. You also had to rebuild your life while part of you still wanted answers. You redirected your attention toward what was actually available instead of remaining emotionally trapped in what you wished would happen. None of that was free. It cost time, emotional energy, patience, and real inner work. That is why your maturity is genuine, and the avoidant may recognize that. They may see the difference between performed indifference and genuine peace. They may sense the difference between someone pretending not to care and someone who has actually processed what they felt. That recognition can make the embarrassment deeper because they are not only seeing the outcome, they may also sense what it required. While you were grieving, rebuilding, and becoming more grounded, they may have been managing discomfort through distance. Avoidance can provide short-term relief. Growth requires paying the emotional cost, but you do not need to turn that difference into a competition. You do not need to keep proving that you are stronger or more mature. Real maturity is much simpler. You continue feeling honestly. You continue behaving responsibly. You trust your own perception without demanding outside approval. You keep building what is genuinely yours. And you do these things because they are now part of who you are, not because you want a reaction from someone else. Their embarrassment is real, but it is theirs. Your life is real, and it is yours. Both realities can exist at the same time. Your maturity may continue to affect them simply because genuine things are visible, but you do not need to use that visibility as a tool. Let them experience whatever their own awareness brings up. You keep living. You keep growing. You keep inhabiting the place you worked so hard to reach. Because the goal was never to make the avoidant embarrassed. The goal was to become emotionally honest enough to handle a difficult experience without abandoning yourself, and you did. That is enough. You are not waiting for their reaction to prove your growth was real. You are already living the answer. Whatever happens next in their journey, your forward movement can remain beautifully simple. Keep being where you genuinely are now.